Hey, my name is Matt Stohrer and I repair saxophones for a living. And today I would like to talk to you about the Conn set screws on their older saxophones that hold the pivot screws in place. These set screws, what I'm talking about, are this little tiny guy here. Okay, saxophone keys are attached to the instrument in two different ways. One is a hinge rod, where you've got a long rod inside the key and the key pivots on it. The other way is when you've got a long, solid key, and at either end you've got a pivot screw holding it in place. And what will hold this key in place securely, firmly, and moving in only the direction it's supposed to be is when the receiver, so the piece that's cut out inside this key, fits the shape of this exactly, and this is exactly how far in it needs to be. If it's too far in, the key will bind, right? The key will not turn because it's too tight. If it's too far out, the key will move around, and it will be too loose and it will knock around, and the pad will not sit in the same place every time. For a bit more on this concept, you can see my video on key fit and the G-sharp bis connection. So Conn, the way that they attack this problem of getting your pivot screws to fit well is they made a pivot screw, of which I'm holding one, that has a flat spot machined in the middle, and you can screw it in as far as you want because it doesn't have a head, right? So you can screw it in as far as you want, and then this little tiny set screw here, screw that in, it pushes against the side here and locks it in place. And it is I think, a really wonderful answer to the problem. A lot of technicians will complain about it though, because after so much time, because these instruments were made from the 20s through I forget when they stopped putting these on. I don't work on later Conns very much. I think the 50s. They're not made of stainless steel. They're made of hardened steel, and that means that they can rust over time. And when these little tiny screws get rusted inside these posts, they're very difficult to remove. But I'll come back around to that later. But when they're in proper operating condition, they're actually a really, really nice system because you can fit these rods. You can see I'm trying to move these keys. Nothing's happening, but everything moves slick and is very nice and quiet. So it's a really nice way to do it, I think. So let me show you how this works. And apologies if I get in the way of the camera here. I'm working through the viewfinder and it's not always easy. Okay, so I'm going to take this little screw all the way out to show you what we're looking at here. Okay, so here is the locking screw. That is a 1/64 hardened steel screw with a cone point. And if you need replacements, you can get them from Ferree's Tools, Ferree'(s) Tools. The part number is C47, and they are exactly like the originals. There are others available. There's actually Kraus Music is another way you can get these, but they sell ones that are 172, and they don't fit right. So I would not advise getting them from Kraus. Get the C47. C is in cat, 47 from Ferree's Tools. They're 164 and they fit exactly if you need replacements. And you may need replacements if you have these that have gotten rusted out. Now, if they're completely rusted and you have to drill out this little hole here, you're probably going to damage the threads. I've gotten pretty good at using a super tiny Dremel bit to get these out without damaging the screws or damaging the threads, but that's not always possible, especially if it's rusted so much it's actually, the rust has kind of like made everything solid and you can't even get the little bits. Actually, you can see there's still a little tiny piece of one of these screws wrapped around this Dremel because the saxophone I'm showing you right now had 2 or 3 of them that were stuck. If you have to drill this out, a very easy replacement is to take a 256 machine screw. You can thread this out to 256, chop this off, and put a slot in it. And it is mostly indistinguishable as far as look, and the function is still very good. So that's what I do to replace these when I have to cut them out. But I've gotten, like I said, much better at getting them out without needing to rethread them, as evidenced by this little ring of set screw left around my Dremel bit. Okay, so the way this works, so I've got the set screw out, and I'll pull out the pivot screw, show you what that looks like. So there's the pivot screw, right? Here's the key. So when you put these in, you'll screw it in and you can feel where it's loose, and then it starts to bind, right? And you can see, let's see if I can show you this. It'll actually move the screw a little bit. That's when you know it's binding. Back it off a little until it's not doing that. Okay, and then you take your set screw, and the set screw, when you screw it in, and apologies again if I get in the way of the camera, this is kind of a finicky thing to do, and I've magnetized this screwdriver specifically for doing these. Okay. When you screw the set screw in, it is actually going to kind of pin the screw against, because it's not, I mean, it's not absolutely tight inside its threads here, the pivot screw isn't. So when you tighten this in and you go all the way down, it is going to move, you can actually maybe even see it a little bit. It's going to move the pivot screw against the wall, and it'll actually change the fit just a little bit, so you have to feel afterwards. So this is binding a little bit, it's a little slow. So even though without the set screw engaged it was fit well, when I engaged the set screw it was a little tight. And you'll find that that happens. So I will back it off a little bit, probably about a, if you think of the screw as a clock, I turn it, you know, counterclockwise 1 hour, and then tighten the set screw again and see where I'm at. Better, but not absolutely free. I think I'll turn it back like a half hour. And when you are just doing adjustments, you only have to back this little screw off a tiny little bit. You know, one turn or a half turn is enough for you to be able to screw the set or the pivot screw in and out. But when you are removing or installing the pivot screw, because the threads are wider than the machined part in the middle. Come on, focus. You'll have to remove the set screw most of the way to get around those threads. Otherwise, you can damage the threads when you're screwing them in and out. So let's see. Okay, now I'm absolutely free. And I'll take this and make sure. A tiny bit of movement. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to go back in just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit. Okay, no movement, and it's free. And that is how you use the Conn set screws. On older saxophones, on older Conns, you'll see that the pivot screw looks more like this, with a non-tapered point. These have their own problems as far as fit, but they do work mostly the same way as the tapered versions. The tapered versions are better because the taper allows you to fit it end to end as well. Whereas with a flat point like this, it's you're more reliant upon the posts to hold the key from moving this way. Whereas with the taper, it's actually the entire length of this screw is held only, or the entire length of the rod is held only on the tapered point of the pivot screw. And you do not need the post to be touching the end of the key in order for it to be functioning correctly. But that's what the older Conn saxes will look like, and the same pivots or the same set screws will work. And yet when I get Conn saxophones in for overhaul, the first thing I do is take some penetrating oil. I use PB Blaster and apply it to all of the pivot screws and all of the set screws and let it sit for a day or two. And I find all but the most banged up and rusted out saxophones, I can get those pivot screws out pretty easy. This instrument, although it was in very, very good physical condition, had not been worked on in a long time. So a few of these were rusted in place. But that is the Conn set screw system and how to deal with it. And again, you can get replacements. I usually keep 100 or so on hand, and I find that I replace probably a third of the set screws I come across. Not as many of those are stuck, but a lot of times they'll just be a little bit chewed up, especially this slot here. Unless you've got a screwdriver that fits it really well and is nice and hard like this one, you are going to chip or kind of oval out that slot, and that makes it very difficult to deal with. So I replace them if the slots are damaged as well. So that's about it. Hope you found this helpful, useful, informative. My name is Matt Stohrer. I repair saxophones for a living. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to get in touch or leave a comment here. Thanks for watching.